My name is Suprean, and I'm originally from New Orleans, but I've lived and worked in Houston for the last 20 years now. Originally, background is in music. I grew up playing in punk bands and kind of deeply involved in the political punk movement of the 90s and when I was living in New Orleans, and was always a guy who drew the posters for shows and album covers for friends' bands. But I grew up pretty blue collar. Didn't really have the understanding that you could be an artist. You know, that was not something that was really in the world that I was in. So when I got to undergraduate school, I went in as a physics major. I've always been a science guy, and was pursuing that, but also making weird things in my dorm room, paintings and things that I just was doing for myself. I was looked to try to get into this music appreciation class because I needed an art credit, but the music appreciation class was full. So by accident, kind of fell into this art appreciation class, where I eventually met Virgil Grotefeld, who was teaching at the school, an OG Houston artist, who saw some of these things I was making in my dorm room and was like, hey man, you should be an artist. But you know, he convinced me slowly. I kept taking classes with him, and just over time, just kind of fell into it, you know, and it just kind of became everything. I gave up music just because I wanted to put everything into art. Virgil knew that if I was going to go into grad school, he'd have to help me get out a fellowship. You know, I didn't have the money for it, but he helped me get a fellowship. Wound up at TCU, where I pursued an MFA in painting, and yeah, I guess the rest is history. Moved back to Houston because I love the community and the scene here, and just have been at it ever since. The paintings that I make really kind of have their origin in experimental paints that I manufacture myself. I think all painting in some ways, especially after modernism, is how do you make a new kind of painting, right? And there's all kinds of ways of making new kinds of paintings. And for me, especially with the kind of process-based experimental scientific background, I was really drawn to the chemistry of paint making. And so started making experimental paints that could do interesting and kind of new things on the surface of a canvas. Pigment-wise, using a lot of mineral and crystal dust, which is what give the paintings that kind of holographic or glittery kind of sparkle, almost a feeling of light being like trapped inside the surface of the painting. The paints that I make, I'm very interested in how they can reflect geological forces. I think of the paintings as primarily as landscape paintings. They're very couched, obviously, in the language of abstraction and color field painting. So the paintings are painted flat, and they're painted without brushes. So the paint is applied in very thin, very liquid, fluid layers, and it's washed and stained across the canvas over and over. So the paintings themselves kind of build up like a sedimentary landscape. Which is, I think, you know, even further conceptually reinforced by the fact that there's a lot of earth in the paint. There's mineral and crystal in the paint. And how I'm using the paint is often meant to mirror certain geological forces in nature. So the way tectonic layers shift to create cracks, I'm doing that with the paint by how I layer it. The way water evaporation affects the life cycle of glaciers, I'm using water on top of the paint and evaporating it over time to create and pull out various types of texture. The paintings that have more of these kind of geometric kind of swoops, again, aren't made with brushes or with tape. They're made by simply pooling very liquid paint at one end of a canvas and then very much lifting and kind of tilting and pushing and repeating that motion over and over again until those shapes begin to kind of stain into it. So the painting process itself is very physical. It's very much a kind of nuanced dance between like my body and the canvas, which is both highly engaging for me as the painter, but I think also again kind of ties the work into that history of process art and kind of finding the image within the paint itself. I mean, some of the art I'm most interested in, same way, it's that kind of magic trick or kind of sleight of hand where I have to ask myself, how did the artist, do this? And I think you're right. There's an art historical connotation of that, right? Trying to carve out a space, a new thing that paint can do. You've got to kind of know the past to reinvent it, right? Absolutely. And I'm very much interested in trying to do things with paint that are a little bit more difficult to figure out how they've kind of been done. When you're looking at the paintings, there's kind of two distinct kind of modes. There are, a lot of the painting itself is this kind of push and pull of control. How much of control am I exerting versus how much control is the paint itself exerting and taking over? And I think obviously, that sense of discovery of kind of finding something new, right, that the paint is doing, allowing it enough headroom to do something that surprises me as the artist. They're kind of two distinct modes in the work. There are what I call field paintings, which are very reminiscent of color field paintings. And a friend of mine, local artist Londonham, once called those alien Rothkos, which I think is a kind of funny way of looking at them, because they have this kind of almost alien-like quality, but very much are tied to that history of color field painting. And those very much come out of a sense of discovery. I'm allowing the paint a lot of leeway in those paintings. I'm allowing texture to form that I don't have a lot of control over. And I'm allowing things to happen that are really surprising me. The other kind of mode of painting are what I called field interruptions, where they kind of start as a field of color, but then I'm very purposely going back into it and creating these kind of more geometric shapes, these swoops that again are made by pooling paint at one corner of the painting, lifting, tilting, moving, and staining. So in the field interruption paintings, there's more of the artist's will, right, in those sections. And so between those two bodies or two modes of work, there's hopefully a kind of narrative about control and the limits of control. And I think, right, as artists, we paint for 1,000 different reasons, or we make art for 1,000 different reasons. And one of the things that I think I'm drawn to in paint is how it does reflect the process of life, this kind of push and pull of how much control you can exert over your life versus how much control life is exerting over you. And that balance is such a tenuous thing, in every stage of your life. Working that out on a canvas every day is a kind of meditative way of contemplating that, of experiencing that. But they're also a way for me to reconnect to the land, and a connection to my body with the land that there isn't necessarily always time or space for in daily life, right? So I do hope that the paintings also allow for that in the viewer. There are always these kind of horizon lines, or these kind of lines where the earth and sky kind of meet or touch or separate or break, and my hope is that they induce that kind of sense of awe that one has when you're out in the middle of the country and you look up at the night sky and you can see all the stars at last, or you're sitting, in the beach by the ocean and your view is totally unhampered. It's just you and that existential kind of natural setting. And my hope is that the paintings have a quality of that of some kind. I like art that's generous, that has a lot to give. The art that I want to make is art that kind of traffics in this language of beauty, because it is a kind of as universal a language as we can maybe approach, and therefore has a lot to give the audience. You can really approach the work simply as a beautiful painting. You can approach the work as a product of the history of abstraction. You can approach the work as a product of the history of landscape art or process art, or as meditations on our connection to the land and environment. But hopefully also there's this there's a generosity there, right? That you can really are kind of welcomed into that space, and that there is a lot for the viewer to be gifted within that. Because I feel like the making of the work itself is I feel the work is very generous to me as far as like what I'm getting out of it when I'm making it. And my hope is that it's also doing that same thing for the viewer. I started working with these paints about 10 years ago. Before that, I was making all different types of other things, but I really locked into these paints that I started to manufacture about 10 years ago. This body of work this year, I feel like, is very much a representation of that. It is a culmination of a roughly decade of working with these materials. It incorporates kind of everything I've learned over that decade, and is kind of what I would recognize or say is the start of a multi-year body of work that is going to progress on from this point. That for me as an artist feels very good, right? And I think that's, it's when you can develop a language and then take that language and become very eloquent with it. That's when you're really firing on all cylinders, right? And that's where I hope and where I think feels that I am right now. This moment where I've built this vocabulary, I've built this language, and now I can be very eloquent with it. I can use it in the way that I want to kind of say and do what I wanted to do, in very subtle and nuanced ways. And hopefully that registers with the audience as well. So, it's like the difference between like writing essays and writing poems, I think maybe. And this work very much feels much more like writing poems. It's stripping it down, stripping it down, stripping it down until it's as eloquent as it can be within that vocabulary.